Hi, thanks for being here. And thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to give this presentation, to actually travel to Belgrade for the first time for me, so it was very exciting. Yes, and thank you for the hospitality. I'm actually, like, what I'm going to talk about is really part of my current research and has to do with the questions that William James raises, that Lucia mentioned, but it also comes out of more recent work on the relations between activism, media practices, and forms of perception or perceptual regimes. And it's going to be heavily drawing on theories of affect and the work of Massumi that it has quite a dense conceptual part, which I try to kind of supplement with some kind of visual material. And then the second part is more going into thinking through some of the modalities of the G20, the politics, the visual politics around the G20 summit in Hamburg that happened in 2017. And yeah, it will take around 40-45 minutes. And as I said, it's kind of work in progress, and I really look forward also to your kind of commentaries and ideas to develop that further. That's also how I understand the context. And if you am talking too fast or something is totally not understandable to you, better just say, wait a minute, and ask. So we can clarify that right away. Okay. The G20 Summit 2017 took place in Hamburg from July 6th to the 7th. From July 4th to the 8th, the city of Hamburg declared a 38.5 square kilometer large area as zone of exception by the police, where people could be strip searched without any reason, roads could be blocked for immediate indeterminate periods of time, and any meeting counting more than 2 human subjects could be declared an illegal assembly. One might call this a state of exception. However, as I will argue, this state is not only prolonged indeterminately, the way Giorgio Agamben described it in his text bearing the same name, but rather a modulatory state of sensation, its distribution and suspense. Protest against the G20 summit might be the remaining and most visible remnant of the anti-globalization movement, which took a transnational and media-fused form from the 1999 summit in Seattle onwards. Its cry, "Another world is possible," still haunts the discursive sphere of the movement and informs contemporary forms of protest. Seattle and the following major summits, leading to industrial nations accompanied by social movements' inventive force of public protest, were steadily infused by more aesthetically enhanced and media-versed trajectory. You might know this quite iconic image from the Gezi Park protests. Up until the Arab Spring and the Twitter revolution, the use of and power of social media has steadily gained appraisal from the highest of social movements, and indeed, they have shaped modes of organization, sharing information, and most crucially, creating a counter-aesthetics, or rather alternative distributions of the sensible, than the ones advertised by mainstream media. It was not until the Spanish 15M movement, however, that the question of the aesthetics of social movements' media ecologies has been considered more than a technical means to an end. With the term technopolitics or technopolitica, activist groups in Spain introduced a conception of media practices that not only mobilizes the communicational power of social media efficiently, but also foregrounds the various aesthetic and sensuous modes of activation accompanying social movements. The different formats of technopolitics range from generating an alternative platform called N-1 to mobilization kits of flash mob-like interventions for impromptu protest against the eviction of owners from the mortgaged houses. And for this I have a first video, just to give you an idea of how I think there is different forms of media practices start to fuse in this kind of form of protest. And this is from the Spanish group called En Medio, and it's a video of yeah, you will see it.
Cuando el paro y la privatización la toman desbocados y sin jinetes. Cuando la corrupción es una plaga y los mileuristas son los auténticos afortunados. Cuando los bancos y las grandes empresas ganan más dinero que nunca. Y cuando nos cae encima la ley Mordaza, llega ahora esta segunda edición de ¿Cómo acabar con el mal? Un encuentro internacional de activismo creativo. 4 días de charlas y talleres con la participación de un buen número de agitadores culturales llegados de muchas partes del mundo, dispuestos a intentar contigo nuevos modos de intervención social y nuevas herramientas para la acción directa. Si tienes el futuro hipotecado y estás cansada de no llegar a final de mes, o si no llegas ni a principio de mes, ven con nosotros y entérate de cómo acabar con el mal pasándotelo muy bien.
How to end the This was a video by a group, like a media activist group that was cooperating with PA, the kind of association against the eviction of houses after the kind of economic crisis in Spain. A lot of people couldn't pay their mortgages and they were just basically evicted from their house, as everywhere actually. And they really by now managed to create a nationwide alliance of resisting groups and with lots of legal advice and very concrete measurements to avoid people being evicted. And this shows forms of public protest that use lots of pop cultural references, fuses different media forms, has a humoristic take on things as well, while things are deadly serious, to be honest. But also they produce activist kits online that you could download through PDF, print out, put on these masks, cut out the masks, and create your own kind of flash mob-like intervention. And I think there's something that only could happen through these kind of media environments. But it also creates a more sensuous side to the actual content that is being negotiated in these political forms of protest. So it's in the aesthetics and effectively attentive realm of technopolitics that I want to engage in a first analysis of the Alternative Media Center FCMC as a crucial node in the infrastructures of resistance that were mobilized throughout the G20 summit. So now I show a slideshow, and at the end you will see some of the media center that I'm actually talking about, but don't get confused that other images are going to be shown now, but that's kind of part of my media strategy. Housed in the 2,500 square meter ballroom at the St. Pauli Stadium, who was in Hamburg before? Oh, okay. So this reference is quite important. St. Pauli is one of the 2 local football clubs, and supposedly the most left-wing professional football team in the world. And they are housed in a city, in a part of the city that is not only very central and that's very close to the actual G20 summit, but also adjacent to a neighborhood that conceives itself as fairly alternative. So the FCMC facilitated 400 workstations for journalists, media activists, and bloggers, 2 professional studios for interviews, 10 video and audio working stations for media production, and maintained a 96-hour live stream, an information center and Twitter feed, and hosted 5 press conferences with the key organizers of various demonstrations, the Solidarity Summit, and specific guests such as lawyers, NGO activists around the globe, and researchers. In addition, the structure comprised a soup kitchen, different lounges, resting areas, and a cafe. It was as much a social space of care as it was one of media production and dissemination. A crucial aspect, I will tend to later, was the receiving and archiving of audiovisual material, which many of the over 500 accredited media workers deposited to the center's servers. So there was a kind of technological infrastructure that fused with a social infrastructure, that fused with a political and journalistic infrastructure, and it was kind of a merger of these kind of 2 dimensions. The center's mission was a collective effort to change the perception of the G20 summit in Hamburg. The FCMC was a collective initiative that emerged from different networks of people and associations. The principal idea of the Media Center was to offer bloggers and Twitterers, editorial collectives and staff, video activists, free radios, precarious media workers, and established journalists a space for production that is, quote, from the website, much cooler than the official G20 Media Center, unquote. You will see what I mean in a second. Thanks to its setup, the FCMC facilitated a change in the media coverage during the G20 summit in Hamburg. Let's see, I jumped a bit. So these are kind of all images that were publicly released around the G20, and it's about the kind of aesthetics that I'm curious of. And this is the video that shows the official media center and the official press media center of the G20 summit and some part of the alternative media center. So you see alternative and FCMC. Thanks to its setup, the FCMC facilitated a change in the media coverage during the G20 summit in Hamburg. It understands itself as a material semiotic device to reclaim journalism for social justice and to free it from the suffocating embrace of states, corporate PR, and commercial interests. As such, the FCMC is a meta-medium to reinvent critical media, news, and reporting. Its slogan was to reinvent critical journalism in times of effective populism. In the following, I will move through some aspects of the G20 summit and the FCMC's modes of operating with the aim of developing the two concepts of activist sense and of effective relaying. The prior, activist sense, relates to the question of sensuous activation in the way and overall distribution of the sensible not only concerns how things become felt under specific media conditions and through sensuous capacities, but how modes of activation with and through sensuous capacities becomes a crucial concern for media activism. The latter, effective relaying, concerns the modalities through which such activations of the sensuous operate across spatio-temporal confinements without giving up their situatedness. So one is kind of how do we actually get bodies and people engaged in a way that goes beyond the general visual language of signs and symbols. And the second question is how actually these kind of forms of activation create new alliances across different places while being very specific to the sites where they actually happen. So what I call a translocal connection. So next part is called How to Preempt the Politics of Sensation. So before I get closer to the notion of activist sense, I would like to hint at what has been termed the politics of preemption as integral part of the lead up to the events of the G20. Is that okay in terms of the speed? So the image you can see was published in an article by the tabloid newspaper Mopo on March 29, 2017, more than 3 months before the actual summit. It depicts two masked male individuals jumping on a car's roof while a police car in the background is burning. The image originates from the Toronto G20 summit in 2010. The headline translates as G20 Summit in Hamburg, what's ahead of us? As usual, in their modes of address and inclusion, the populist press uses the we form, assuming that each reader of their website feels as part of the group. What is curious here is the semblance of the image preempting the actual events at the G20, or rather, the reductionist media representation focusing almost exclusively on violence, vandalism and rioting, eclipsing the manifold, peaceful and very creative forms of protest, which involved up to 76,000 people in the streets of Hamburg. And I mean, like I showed the kind of slides before, they were totally in the vein of this narrative of violence, protest violence, veiled people, the black bloc logic of narratives. In his book, Onto Power, Brian Massumi traces the military doctrine of George W. Bush's administration as preemption, and I will clarify what I mean by this term that I just used before in relation to this image, preempting the event of the G20. Preemption is the cutting-edge paradigm of warfare strategies that have diffused into all domains of everyday life, and, as I will explore here, especially into the field of perception. If in former war strategies prediction tended towards probabilistic measurements, deterrence defines the second phase. So Massumi makes a differentiation between prediction, deterrence, and preemption. Deterrence, so prediction is pretty clear, huh? You have kind of statistics, you see like what might happen, and then you kind of make decisions based on that. Whereas deterrence aims at a certain degree of self-causation occurring when threat is held in futurity by being fully realized as the concretest of possibilities in the present in such a way as to define a self-propelling movement all its own. Deterrence, however, is still based on an objective cause, that of a fabricated potential future fact such as the threat of a nuclear strike. And Massumi gives the kind of example of the constant quarrels over North Korea and the United States and the potential threat of a nuclear strike, which is still based on the kind of fact that, yeah, there are nuclear weapons being owned, but then goes in a continuous deterrence practice. Deterrence means threat, right? So, but there's still this kind of cause. Preemption, however, is a pure proliferation effect of a threat that always requires multiple amplificatory procedures and diffusions in the sense of an effective operative logic that is defining a political epoch where such a logic combines, as Massumi says, epistemology with ontology. Preemption operates, and I quote from Massumi, not in the sway of any particular existing formation, but sweeps across them all, and where possible sweeps them up in its own dynamic. Put differently, as the quote is over, put differently, itself generates its own form of threat, like the potential terrorist, while endowing itself with powers of self-causation. It causes its very own epistemic and ontological status as that which cannot be known other by producing it in a way that it might be acted upon. This enveloping logic intervenes as the barest level of at the barest level of existence, that is, into experience as bare activity, a term that Massumi borrows from pragmatist philosopher William James. The sweeping of its very agitation means to mobilize the force of activity, which is movement, as the barest mode of existence. It takes movement as the ground from which differences actualize and take form. The processes of emergence are virtually permeating all modes of existence as their potential becoming, that is, their individuation. I'm drawing here on Massumi's long-term engagement with the works of Gilles Deleuze and Gilbert Simondon, and in resonance with these two, Henri Bergson. For Bergson, movement is the guiding principle of a philosophy of emergence and the event, and operates as a general critique of the terminal or substantialist positions of rationalism and idealism with their essences and faculties or categories, but also against the crude empiricism of the positivistic type. A philosophy of the event based on movement conceives of matter being imbued with a constant process of becoming, a difference varied through repetition. Preemption concerns experience in its barest, most nascent state before the actual formation of object and subject, knower and known. It deals, to cite military functionary and head of military under George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, with unknown unknowns. Maybe you remember that amazing kind of television statement where he was starting to talk about the unknown unknowns, or as Massumi calls it, an objective uncertainty. The political tactics of dealing with such unknown unknowns, such as the terrorist threat, is neither predictive nor statistical. The most effective way, Massumi writes, to fight an unspecified threat is to actively contribute to produce it, unquote. What Massumi outlines in terms of war tactics, which actually produces the enemy and the scenarios which are going to be fought against, also functions in relation to centrist experience and perception. And I mean, it's needless to say that it only functions through perception. Maybe you remember Jean Baudrillard talking about the Gulf War that never happened, and making it a media spectacle more than actually giving any evidence of what happens on the ground. Preemption is a particular mode of activation constitutive of a politics of perception. It concerns how the sensuous modalities of the human body are not given, but become composites in an extended media ecology of effective operations, of forces and relations constantly modulating matter and memory to become this or that perception. The question for me now is, not only as Jacques Rancière has it, of identifying so-called aesthetic regimes under which a certain distribution of the sensible takes place. The conditions under which certain kinds of experience and perception can be felt certainly is part of the modulatory power of preemption. In addition to this logic based on the sensuous, I would add what Alfred North Whitehead called non-sensuous perception. A perception that is of a potential kind, not so much in the space-time of the present subject in relation to her environment, but rather a fielding of different past temporalities that inform the experience of the present while actually moving beneath or beside it. For Whitehead, no sense perception can exist in its mere celebration of immediacy of the experience. The non-sensuous in perception relates to the immediate past that informs the experience of the present and without which the present can never become a differentiating event. So there's this kind of microtemporal relation that informs actually how we sense and feel, and what we sense and feel is always actually a kind of after the fact of having felt when we realize that. So it's the whole question that I'm dealing with is actually in this kind of half-second lag of experience where our bodies are ahead of our actual minds or our consciousness. And I think this is the kind of zone where politics are being made through the centuries these days. And it's the kind of question for emancipatory politics of how to kind of deal with these kind of temporal operations in perception. Such a temporal account of perception that is impersonal moves through the sensuous and hints at the affective plane of consistency underneath all perpetual events as actually embodied in conscious experience. Relatedly, in the words of US military intelligentsia, preemptive warfare is not about occupying space, a classic kind of territorial gesture, but owning time. They really say it's about owning time. So Massumi read a lot of these kind of military papers, and this is a term they steadily use. War is about owning time. In the logic of, and it's not about owning time in the sense of doing the preventive strike logic. It's about how do you control it, the way things unfold when they actualize. In the logic of preemption, the main interest concerns how to contract the heterogeneous and single temporalities of the past into actualizations, priming them towards a desired effectuation. However, it is not a mere combination of different elements that make it possible to commix. In the logic of preemption, the proliferation of threats held by an overall envelope of fear constitutes a probing of futurities to which one can hope to cope with the ones evoked by oneself better without any guarantee of success. So it's really like creating threats rather than just responding to potential threats. And this is, of course, like part of the politics of fear that relates to paranoia and other kinds of discourses that are quite important, I think, nowadays. Preemptive politics are neither predictive nor based on the deterrence, but are speculatively activating potentialities in the present through a future effect inserting itself in the field of potential that can be felt across bodies and territories. And I mean, like, maybe I have to make a comment here. This is a lot on the debates in affect theory, where affect has been conceived for a long time as something positive, something to be embraced, something that art produces, that kind of forms of collective sociality produce. And Massumi is quite clear that affect in the first place is neither good or bad, but there is a kind of layer in experience that politics is negotiated that is beyond the signifier, beyond representation, or before rather beyond. So, and this is the kind of terrain that the military and social media are as much interested in as artists are or activists. So it's something that is neither good or bad in the first place. I think that's quite important, and which gets often misunderstood in thinking about affect. The relation of temporalities of the past as immediately felt dimensions of present becoming, like a body in time and space, tending towards other potential becomings, defines the realm of affect as temporal processing. It is this temporal relaying that begs the question of how processes of sensuous activation happen underneath the rational meaning structures, but with a true sense for what might happen. This is a really felt suspension of the present through a threat in times of a politics of fear. And I think this is kind of the key of my argument, that affect is not something that is intersubjective in the first place, and it has to do with kind of how things come together under which conditions, and what does it mean temporally for that to happen. It's not in an affect in the intersubjective way. I would always call it an affection. So that's maybe the kind of conceptual differentiation I make. If I talk about affection, it's something that is intersubjective, that is social, but affect in itself is more of a plane from which different events occur. Without having the time to go into the intricacies of the operational logic of preemption, I want to emphasize the general shift from territorial logics of occupation to practices of owning time. Massumi's, and I mean, like, I show this image here because it kind of is 3 months in advance of the actual event happening, and it kind of is part of the whole media environment that pre-stages how the events actually took place. So you saw the actual imagery from the events that totally mirror what has been produced effectively through the media before the event actually took place. Massumi's reading of affect takes the material ground of bodies as the composites of other bodies that form these composites by their varying yet oriented capacities to affect and being affected. So if I talk about bodies, it's human bodies as much as physical stuff, material stuff, as also forming bodies. So it's an extended concept of the body. This concerns the human body. I wrote this, okay. Affect is a temporal dimension in the overall polyrhythm of bodies compositing. Instead of externalizing itself in space as a given, it denotes the constitutive field of becoming. If we think of the human body, Massumi has shown through the Liebig experiment, the famous half-second, that the organic and energetic materiality of the human body facilitates a relational capacity of moving with its environment, temporally, that is, non-sensuously and non-consciously. In other words, our bodies are of a future that only recursively becomes part of our conscious experience. And here I have a quote from Massumi where he writes, "This requires a reworking of how we think about the body. Something that happens too quickly to have happened actually is virtual. The body is as immediately virtual as it is actual. The virtual, depressing crowd of incipiencies and tendencies is a realm of potential. In potential is where futurity combines unmediated with pastness. The virtual is a lived paradox where what we are normally opposite coexist, coalesce, and connect. Where what cannot be experienced cannot but be felt, albeit reduced and contained." And I think this is typically Massumian in the way he phrases things, but what is crucial here is that this unmediatedness, which is quite contradictory to a Hegelian conception, for instance, of experience and phenomenology, that the unmediatedness is something that is quite important if we want to think about media and perception, which often presumes the perceiving subject and medium. And what happens if we think these on an affective level that is always already on the same plane of the virtual and the actual. So experience without mediation is maybe the challenge that I pose with the question of actors, etc. It is this interval of a perceptual becoming which interests Massumi in elaborating a theory of preemptive politics as a politics of perception. In relation to warfare, he analyzes military techniques of inserting the choreographing of the perceptual field as a plane of emergent bodily experience, where the way how experience passes, as felt, can be modulated. The modulation of affect towards specific ends lies at the heart of preemptive politics. Going back to the newspaper image and its caption, the newspaper image was here. One can refer to the semiotic level and relate, as Camilla Christoph has done in her work Antivism and Affect, the effective realm of perception to the realm of discourse. So how language is used here alongside the image, for instance, or what kind of text the image discloses about political protest and mainstream media coverage. While I would actually agree that an effective capture moves through the sensuous and the discursive in the image, I want to add that the image as such cues potential unfoldings of the events 3 months ahead, not predicting, but preempting it by inserting a future cause into the present, while still remaining utterly uncertain. As Massumi writes, threat has become form and it tends to proliferate unpredictably. A politics of preemption as effective politics aims at cueing the field of perceptual emergence through a modulation of unpredictabilities that nevertheless allow for an internal resonance to occur and thus to build up redundancy after the actual unfolding of the event. And I think it's quite important how this kind of dealing with uncertainty is not an anything goes, but it builds up certain forms, certain patterns of redundancy, where you can then control fear as a kind of very precise technique to create social events or to legitimize political action or military action. So it's nothing that is arbitrary. But these are techniques that really deal in a non-probabilistic way with uncertainty and to try to kind of control how uncertainty can be played as a general motor of threat. And that, of course, legitimizing all sorts of military action, spending, invasion, etc. In the case of the G20, there is a sensuous envelope, and of course this is not limited to the military, but concerns a lot of the police strategies during these protests too. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but now they have written visual algorithms for drones to analyze movements during political protests, where the police can then really probabilistically try to intervene. But not only that, they create cartographies of uncertainty that then, through the kind of visual analysis of these protests, really help them to prevent protests to happen, actually. In the case of the G20, there is a sensuous envelope of unpredictable modes of violence and potential threat that permeate politicians' utterances, police risk estimation plans, and the press reproducing these discursive uncertainties. However, the actual temporal cueing happens not in the discursive, but in the sensuous forms, which create signs and images cutting across time. I mean, it's kind of interesting for me how signs and images are not this kind of enclosed entities anymore that are attached to a specific event, but really create, like here from 2010, inserted into the news media of 2017, create a narrative that has a historicity in the visual language of violence during protests, that is the kind of mainstream press narrative, while actually already colonizing future events and how they could happen. And all you got in the mainstream media around the G20 number was violence. It is in this way I conceive of the preemptive politics around the G20 summit that creates a cross-temporal closed feedback loop of an aesthetic regime which calls for different media ecological events. The FCMC didn't form in opposition to mainstream media, but from an urge to create and contract other tendencies, temporalities, and non-sensuous perceptions, as followed through the main events of the G20. Its aim was and still is to plug the effective logics cued by preemptive politics to another kind of machine, allowing for the event to become felt in their diverse capacities for activation. In other words, it aims at a counter-aesthetics or an alternative aesthetic politics. Now I'll show a video again, and now it's becoming less conceptually heavy. This is actually just to give you some impressions of how the FCMC looked like. I mean, this is of course in German, and you don't hear the text, but you see this was the press conferences and different ways of, The question of a project such as the FCMC resided not only in the making of an alternative stream of information alongside the events of the G20. If it takes its socially, technologically, and in terms of converging practices pluriversal character seriously, it would tend towards alternative effective politics of the compositions and at the constitutive level between perception, bodies, and thought. I think this kind of doing these together is the key. The concept of activist sense takes on this role in its multi-layer of personality. Effective politics capable of countering preemption have to shift their focus on the temporalities through which experience takes hold of the body, that is the emergent field of becoming in its most potentialized phase. I borrowed the term activity from William James. In Essays in Radical Empiricism, he writes, I will quickly stop this video and jump. Because the quote is quite long. Taken in the broadest sense, any apprehension of something doing is an experience of activity. And he continues, bare activity then, as we may call it, means the bare act of event or change. Change taking place is a unique content of experience, one of those conjunctive objects which radical empiricism seeks to earnestly rehabilitate and preserve. The sense of activity is thus, in the broadest and vaguest way, synonymous with the sense of life. And I mean, it's quite important for James to mention that he belongs to the school of pragmatism, but an utterly different pragmatism than the ones of the, let's say, 1950s to 1990s, or to present day, that is a more utilitarian concept of pragmatism. James, with his radical empiricism, really tries to rethink experience from a more than human perspective that is not necessarily comparable to a phenomenological concept of experience. And I think that's a line that Massumi follows, and I think that's quite interesting, especially if you come from the Central European tradition of phenomenology. Me as a German, I've been bombarded with that. It's another possibility to think experience. No, key on time. I lost track of it. James further elaborates from this existential ground of activity as a part of it comes with the definite direction as what he calls tendency. I read that again because it's really important. James further elaborates that from this existential ground of activity, a part of it comes with definite direction as what he calls tendency. It is such tendency through which bare activity becomes felt in its infinite capacities of activating. Only as a tendency, the power of potential becomings is met with the actual capacitation of other tendencies to move into a formation of a sensuous experience. So again, also James is very much concerned with the question of how, well, yeah, we have the base movement of activity and change as the kind of pulsing of existence, but so what? What actually emerges, and how do things emerge? So to fight a kind of relativistic argument that whatever. So there is tendency. There is sense. Put in effective terms, the capacitation of tendency to relate and resonate makes up the very texture of experience. It makes sense. The notion of activist sense emphasizes the double process of activity moving through the senses, activating through it, while actually engaging in sense-making. Sense, similar to the French meaning of the word, gives a direction. So there's sens, in French means actually sensuous, and it means sense making or making sense, but it also means direction. The trajectory through which formally heterogeneous elements or tendencies resonate in order to amplify their capacities. Activist sense foregrounds this collective effort of amplification of potentialities through the very capacity of such tendencies to affect being affected. The question of how to activate in order to make sense when moving through the sense with centrist defines FCMC's main concern. Sense takes on a double meaning. It has to interface centrist elements in order to cue them into sense-making or relevant compounds. If perception concerns the affective, that is temporal, relaying of different kinds of activity to actualize, the centrist is never a given, but something that is composed between the body and its environment by mutually altering either of them. In Massumi's terms, this process is a differential attunement of affective forces. In the making of perception, as a retrospectively experienced activation and contraction of forces, differential attunement ensures not only that heterogeneous temporalities non-centristically contract into an unfolding of a perceptual event, but also that such an event cues different bodies and their modalities into their becoming without having to synthesize them. It puts bodies into alliance as part of the material and spatio-temporal welter of experience through the cueing of non-centrist perception. The manner in which these cueings constitute a collective process of becoming determines how sense becomes felt. It is sense beyond the more traditional conception of meaning. Meaning would refer to the overall context of an event. It is a retrospective operation. Sense, on the other hand, arises in the midst of a situation, not as a unification but a production of differentials in the midst of their emergence. In fact, it is a dissential, it is essential as much as differential attunement, which seizes the experiences of multiple bodies. The power of perception in the making of non-centrist activation and dissential attunement is the common ground of emergent aesthetic politics. What does it mean then to have a body, to think and feel, to be enmeshed in an operative order of preemptive media tactics, and how does one come to act in these fields? What the FCMC tried to generate was primarily a space of gathering and making. It set the conditions of emergence for what Massumi calls counter-power. Counter-power is not a binary concept. If experience is basically the interfacing and cueing of bare activity towards specific attunements by way of tendencies resonating, then counterpower banks on the emergent quality of experience. The FCMC was not just a space for the production of blocks of percepts and affects, but rather an infrastructural element in a larger constellation of forces, attempting to set conditions of emergence that compose the centrist by activating other temporalities than the news feeds of chronological media. It engaged in different modes of suspense and composed an affect space of care, shelter and rest, as much as acceleration, intervention, and most importantly, aesthetic concerns. Its point of departure was the care for another mode of effectuating, of cueing effective relays to its various platforms, but also bodies in space and time, inside and outside the center before and after the event. It was and still might be a genuine machine for transtemporal, translocal, or transcorporeal relaying of affects. Counterpowers of resistance move through the body as vessel for activist sense to resonate in a collective event. Rather than foregrounding the refined technical infrastructure or musing about social media platforms' limited capacities, the relaying of affect banks on the immediate interfacing of technological and bodily infrastructures as material and vital support for action, as Butler suggests, Judith Butler. In this sense, affect is of the body as much as it composes bodies. It is not an affect of the subject. Rather, affect capacitates bodies to tune in their very becoming. In this sense, media theorist Anna Munster writes, quote, corporeal experience, or aspects of it, it extends and intensifies, and in so doing, splits, folds, or reflects away from the sense of the body as bound and closed to the outside world. And she concludes, affect arises relationally, and is produced out of the difference between being in the body and representing mapping the body from the outside. Affect sustains the singularity of sensing and of representing as different experience of embodiment, one in which alterity has a place. I don't know if I would still use the word alterity here, but it's to be discussed. Activist sense not only denotes experiences their activity, but is concerned with the ethical questions of relaying differential capacities in their joys that is potentiating counterpowers across bodies, times, and spaces. Joys, I mean like Spinoza's sense of joys is expanding the field of potentials. I can say a bit more when we are in the discussion of this. Affective interfacing means to relay temporalities, or in the words, okay, here's something that's cut. In the words of William James, longer and shorter span activities. Such a practice engages in an operative logic as an ontological and epistemological speculation which aims at altered accomplishments in the capacitation one might feel of what might be felt and thought in the midst of an event such as the G20. And they actually have another part on effective relaying, but I guess I stop here because we otherwise don't have so much time for conversation. And I would like to add that 2 or 3 aspects of the media center that are quite important to me that relate to how it tried to create a counter politics to the mainstream media narratives of the G20. It was not only creating a space for activists and media practitioners to work in a different way than the official media center allowed, but it also concerned time and temporality in a very concrete sense, that the people working there were by far not able to maintain a news stream as mainstream media are capable of. So what we had to do was to live with the fact that whatever we produced as part of this media center, other than the press conferences that were live streamed, and we had other kinds of live events being streamed directly, we had to deal with the temporality of lagging behind. In lagging behind the actual events, once we accepted that, we were able to create way more artistically, I would say, with the material we received. And that's another temporal layer that is quite important about the media center, that it received tons of footage of the people storing their stuff, which then, after the event actually finished, the G20 finished, becomes quite relevant for the legal cases and accusations of certain people being involved in juridical acts and to counter-proof narratives of the police, for instance. So it has a temporality that goes way beyond the actual event where things happen. And the third aspect that I would like to emphasize, it's not just large infrastructure being built up, technological infrastructure, and media professionals, artists, and activists, and lots of academics actually making this happen, but and creating content that contests the mainstream narratives of the G20. But it was also very much an infrastructure of care, of bodies being held, of people coming in wounded, needing support, medical support, but also needing moral or ethical support because of the kind of experiences they had on the streets. So what was supposed to be a media center in the first place became also all sorts of other kinds of relays for an effective gathering that is maybe more concrete on the intersubjective level of caring for each other. And that is an integral part of these kind of protest structures that I think is not in opposition to the social media technologies or the technological apparatus of the police or the state or the mainstream media. So they are all interrelated, and I think that's nevertheless one of the kind of very particular experiences I took from it, that actually a space, an alternative media center, became also a space of care of all kinds of questions and problems. And I think this is also for the future of how to think about counter-politics, the way in the Massumi talks about it, is the question of how to sustain these kind of infrastructures of care as much as alternative media structures and alternative contexts, as Erin said.